The Phantom Janitor. Sarah was a new nurse at the city's oldest hospital, a place with creaking floors and dimly lit hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. The building had seen countless patients over the decades, and many claimed it held secrets in its walls. On her first night shift, Sarah was anxious but determined to prove herself. As she made her rounds through the empty corridors, she noticed an elderly janitor slowly mopping the floor. He was tall and thin, wearing an old-fashioned uniform that looked like it belonged in a different era. His cap was pulled low over his face, obscuring his features. Sarah, wanting to be polite, smiled and thanked him for his hard work. The janitor paused for a moment, nodded silently, and continued with his task. Night after night, Sarah saw the janitor in the same spot, mopping the same section of the floor. She found it strange that he was always there, never venturing to other parts of the hospital. He didn't speak, didn't interact with anyone, and always seemed to appear and disappear without a trace. One evening, Sarah mentioned the janitor to a fellow nurse, expecting a casual response. Instead, her colleague gave her a puzzled look. "What janitor? We haven't had a janitor here for years," she said, her voice tinged with concern. Confused, Sarah asked other staff members, but no one else had seen the man. Determined to solve the mystery, she began digging into the hospital's history. Late at night, after her shift ended, she pored over old records and newspaper clippings in the hospital's small library. Finally, she found an article from over 50 years ago. The story was about a janitor named Mr. Thompson who had worked at the hospital for decades. He was a kind, quiet man who took pride in his work. But one night, while cleaning the floors, a tragic accident occurred. Mr. Thompson slipped on a wet patch, fell down a flight of stairs, and broke his neck. He died instantly in the very hallway where Sarah had seen him. The hospital staff mourned his death, but as time passed, Mr. Thompson was forgotten, except by those who claimed to have seen his ghost. Over the years, there were occasional reports of a janitor silently mopping the floors at night, always in the same spot, but these sightings were dismissed as mere legend. Terrified but unable to ignore what she had seen, Sarah decided to confront the spirit. On her next night shift, she walked down the hallway where Mr. Thompson had died, clutching the article in her hand. As expected, the phantom janitor appeared, mopping the floor as if nothing had changed. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I know who you are. You don't have to stay here anymore." The janitor paused, lifting his head slightly as if he had heard her. For the first time, Sarah saw his face, a pale, sorrowful visage with hollow eyes. He looked at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. As he turned to leave, his form began to fade, becoming less and less distinct until he vanished completely. From that night on, Sarah never saw the janitor again, and the hallway felt lighter, as if a burden had been lifted. She continued to work at the hospital, but the experience stayed with her. Sometimes, when she was alone in that hallway, she swore she could still hear the faint swish of a mop against the floor, a reminder of a soul finally at peace. The Warehouse Whisperer. Tom had been working the night shift at the old warehouse for nearly a year. The job was simple: stack boxes, organize shipments, and make sure everything was in its place for the morning crew. The pay was decent, and Tom didn't mind the solitude. The warehouse was massive, a labyrinth of towering shelves filled with goods waiting to be shipped out. During the day, it was a bustling hub of activity, but at night, it was a different story. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the metal shelves or the distant hum of machinery. At first, Tom enjoyed the quiet. It gave him time to think, to clear his mind. But as the months passed, he began to feel uneasy. There was something about the warehouse that didn't sit right with him. The shadows seemed darker, the air colder, and there was a sense of something lurking just out of sight. One night, while Tom was stacking boxes in one of the farthest aisles, he heard it for the first time, a faint whisper. He stopped what he was doing and listened, his heart beating a little faster. The whisper was soft, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of leaves or the distant murmur of a conversation. But there were no trees in the warehouse, no one else around to talk. "Tom," the whisper said, barely audible. "Tom." He turned around, expecting to see someone behind him, but the aisle was empty. The shadows stretched long and dark, the rows of shelves towering above him like silent sentinels. He shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling. Maybe he was just tired, his mind playing tricks on him. But the whisper persisted, growing louder, more insistent. "Tom," it called again. "Over here." Tom's skin prickled with fear, but he couldn't help himself. He followed the sound, his steps slow and cautious. The whisper led him deeper into the warehouse, to a part he rarely visited, a dark, forgotten corner filled with old, unused equipment covered in dust. The air was colder here, and the shadows seemed to press in on him from all sides. In the corner, he saw an old, dusty radio sitting on a shelf. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, the buttons worn, the screen cracked. But as Tom approached, the radio crackled to life, emitting a low, distorted hum. He stared at it in disbelief, unable to comprehend what was happening. The hum grew louder, and then, through the static, a voice emerged. It was garbled, distorted, but unmistakably human. "Tom," the voice said, its tone urgent. "You have to leave. Now." Tom stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the corner was empty. The voice continued, growing more frantic. "Leave before it's too late," it warned. "Don't end up like me." Tom didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, the radio's static fading into the distance as he fled the corner. His footsteps echoed through the empty aisles, the shadows closing in around him. When he finally reached the main floor, he stopped, gasping for breath, his hands shaking. The warehouse was silent again, the only sound the thumping of his own heartbeat in his ears. Tom stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it real? Was it some kind of prank? But deep down, he knew the truth. The voice on the radio had been real, and it had saved him from something terrible. The next day, Tom couldn't get the experience out of his mind. He tried to go about his work as usual, but the memory of the voice, the fear he had felt, lingered. Finally, he decided to ask one of the older workers about the corner where he had found the radio. The man's face went pale when Tom mentioned it. He hesitated, then reluctantly told Tom about a worker who had died in that very corner years ago. The man had been crushed by a falling stack of boxes late one night, his body found the next morning. Since then, no one went near that corner, not after dark. Tom's blood ran cold. The voice on the radio, it must have been that worker, warning him from beyond the grave. He didn't need any more convincing. That night, Tom requested a transfer to the day shift. He didn't care about the pay cut or the change in routine. All he cared about was staying far away from the warehouse at night. And as he walked out of the warehouse for the last time under the light of the rising sun, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone, that the shadows were watching him, whispering, waiting for their next victim. The Haunted Diner. Linda worked the graveyard shift at a 24-hour diner on the outskirts of town. The diner was a popular spot for truckers and night owls, but after midnight, the place was almost always empty. One night, a man walked in, soaking wet from the rain. He sat in a booth near the window and ordered a cup of coffee. Linda served him and noticed that the man never drank the coffee, he just stared out the window, his expression blank. She tried to make conversation, but he remained silent. After an hour, he stood up and left, leaving a $20 bill on the table. The next night, the man returned, wearing the same drenched clothes. This time, Linda noticed something odd, the man left no footprints on the wet floor. She watched him more closely, and when he left, she picked up the $20 bill, only to find it was old and worn, dated from the 1960s. Linda asked the regulars about the man, and they told her about a tragic accident that had happened decades ago. A man had died in a car crash just down the road, on a stormy night, while driving to the diner. Since then, his ghost appeared on rainy nights, searching for something he never found. Linda quit the diner soon after, but she never forgot the man's empty gaze, or the eerie chill that lingered in the air whenever the rain fell at night.